Good afternoon to all. Greeting to all conferences. It's a great honor to be the president of this session called Security and Human Rights for the Relief of Violent Deaths in Latin America. The exhibitor Hitomi Kubo from the UN in the US. Ms. Hitomi has 30 minutes to do her exposition, and then there will be a discussion of the participants of the forum. And I would like to hand the word to Professor Hitomi.
I'd like to thank the moderator, the president of the session, Dr. Daniel Pontón, as well as the organizers of this very important, and I understand, first Latin America virtual forum on human security for human rights. So my appreciation goes to the Permanent Latin American Committee for Crime Prevention, the UN Latin America Institute for the Prevention and Crime and Treatment of Offenders, and of course, as well, the Institute of High National Studies of Ecuador, and the many partners, and of course, all of the participants that are here this afternoon. I apologize that I cannot speak to you in Spanish, but I will do my best also to speak slowly so that the translation can come through well. So again, it's really my pleasure to be with you on behalf of the UN Human Security Unit and the UN Trust Fund for Human Security. What I would like to cover, and I do have a PowerPoint that I will display in a moment. What I would like to cover in my presentation today is, let's see, as I share my screen for you. So what I would like to do today is ultimately to provide a brief overview of human security and its development into an operational framework that provides really great value for the design and operationalization of policies and programming to promote a more comprehensive and preventive approach when addressing very complex or compound challenges. And that includes, of course, the prevention and reduction of crime and violence. So to do so, I'll structure my presentation in the following way. I will begin with an overview of the emergence of human security and its elaboration as an operational and very practical framework that is particularly well suited to address multidimensional challenges. I will then highlight some key characteristics of the high levels of crime and violence in the region and how that context lends itself to a human security-based response, including, of course, ongoing efforts in the region on citizen security that have been ongoing for quite some time. And then finally, I'll close with some lessons from the UN Trust Fund for Human Security programs in the region that provide us a view on areas where expanding the application of human security could be beneficial to addressing crime and violence in the region. And I'll just say I am an expert in the concept of human security and not necessarily in crime prevention and violence. I think the audience here and the many other participants are much better suited to speak to those specifics. So I will highlight, of course, some basic information that I'm sure you're all aware of in terms of the prevalence of crime and violence in the region, but focus much more on sort of the approach itself and the lessons that we've been able to draw from programs in the region. So when human security, I think it's always good to kind of start with a little bit of the history. And in this particular case, when looking at questions of crime prevention and violence reduction, I think it's very important to go back to the beginning and understand the rationale and the dynamics that led to the emergence of the human security approach, because it's quite relevant today, even when we rethink about in the context of COVID-19, the value of this approach for these kind of very complex crises. So when human security formally emerged into the international lexicon in the early 90s, and this was through the UNDP Human Development Report, it wasn't, you have to understand the context in which it was emerging, right? It was at a time when there were great international shifts happening. So we have the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. We have globalization really rapidly increasing and facilitating a much faster flow of technology and communications and capital. We also have dynamics around the rise of non-state actors that were critical in the international arena. And this is both in terms of them being potentially contributors to insecurity, as well as contributors or bridge builders between communities and states and between communities and the international community. And we also have many dynamics through the 60s, 70s, and 80s where we're looking at the international community more broadly and national governments, looking much more in depth into the interrelationship between security and development, or the interplay, we could say, between underdevelopment and insecurity. So these dynamics really spurred the realization that there are a much broader range of, so I'm realizing, sorry to stop, but I'm realizing that you're not seeing my slide. Okay. Oh, maybe this. Okay, sorry. The translation is a little bit delayed, so I'm hearing myself speaking in the beginning. My apologies. So these dynamics really spurred the realization that there was a much broader range of threats and challenges that could undermine the stability of communities, undermine the stability of a state, and even the international community. And that our prevailing paradigms at that time, so our more traditional approaches to security and also to development, were not adequately capturing the diverse types of threats, including those that were exacting the greatest toll on people, societies, and economies. So again, some of those that I mentioned already, but also we did have some pandemics at that time, and there was a lot of recognition around droughts, particularly in the Americas, that disasters and climate security may be things that need to be addressed or be thought about as security challenges. This was further underlined by the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s that really underscored how significant threats, typically considered peripheral to security, so typically outside of the security paradigm, could threaten the stability, prosperity, and progress of, again, countries and communities, and that we were really inadequately prepared to prevent the devastation of these types of threats, as well as their downside risks. So the ways in which one threat could have impacts on multiple different areas of people's lives. And again, I think this is very obvious in the situation we are now all living in with COVID-19, how one particular threat can really have deep and devastating impacts on many different dimensions of our lives and on our survival, our livelihoods, and the dignity of people. So in short, human security was really offered as a sort of a paradigm shift, as a complement to national and state security. So again, not something that was replacing national security or state security. This is still really important, but something that was complementing it and allowing us to deepen sort of our understanding of the relationship between the state and people. So ultimately, as a new paradigm, human security was really underscoring that we need to consider the survival, livelihood, and dignity of people as the fundamental basis for a prosperous and stable society and global community. So ultimately, if people are not secure, then we can't really have a fully secure state, and we can't really have a fully secure global community as well. It recognizes that, and this is a statement that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, it's been used a lot, but it's very important, and it's very much the framework that human security was introducing, which is that no country can enjoy development without security, security without development, and neither without the respect for human rights. As I mentioned, human security was acknowledging that people, if we look at the level of individuals and communities, we have to recognize that they're faced with a much broader range of insecurities, and that these insecurities are often deeply interconnected, they're often compound, and they have to be addressed together. So it's rare that we could have a situation of, say, income insecurity and not have other types of insecurities that would be related to that, such as health insecurity or food insecurity, etc. And that it doesn't support really meaningful transformation unless we're able to address those various insecurities together and understand how they're interconnected. Human security also was very purposefully prevention-oriented. It wanted to focus on addressing the root causes of these insecurities, really those structural, behavioral factors that lead to vulnerability and the inability for communities or people to cope with crises, so that when there is a threat or a risk or a shock, which there will always be, these types of threats don't undo years of development or generate conditions in which further grievances can escalate or further insecurities can arise. Ultimately, although it is a very ambitious concept and a broad concept, I mean, if we think about bringing together development, security, and human rights, this is a very broad concept, but ultimately it is a practical one. And it is one, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, it is a tool that can help us actually develop policies and programs that can better address sort of these complex situations through a more people-oriented and people-driven and people-centered approach. Really briefly, I'll just go through some of the sort of common ways in which the concept itself is conceptualized. So human security recognizes 3 freedoms as fundamental to people's lives. So as I mentioned before, the survival, livelihoods, and dignity. This is also linked to the 3 freedoms. So freedom from fear, threats to safety of people in all forms. So from individual violence to things like interstate conflict. Freedom from want, so this is threats to basic needs, your economic, social, and environmental aspects of life, the sort of sustainable development component. And then freedom to live in dignity, threats to the human rights, and by extension, access to services and opportunities, so people can actually realize their aspirations in life. It's also breaking this down sort of into a more measurable way or a more concrete way. And this is really drawn from the UNDP Human Development Report in 1994. It was a way to sort of make it, again, more practical. Human security can be further understood as the combination of these 7 dimensions of insecurity. So economic, food, health, environment, political, community, and personal security. And I won't go into the meaning. I think most of these are quite obvious. But the idea is that that each individual requires security in all of these elements of life in order to be secure. And of course, these are just indicative elements. You could have other components as relevant. So I will not go into detail on the sort of long road to the adoption of General Assembly Resolution 66290, which was adopted by consensus in 2012 by the member states of the United Nations. But it's important to share that it was the first resolution on human security, and that provided a common understanding of the concept. So this is not a formal definition. As many of you may know, it's often very difficult to agree on very precise definitions within the context of the UN, and sometimes it's not always as helpful to do so. But this provides the parameters by which member states understand human security. And what I would like to highlight here is, again, that member states, or the governments of the UN, recognize not only the value of the concept, but that it is an approach, right? It is a tool. It is an instrument that we can use. And they identified the 4 principles that it calls for. So people-centered, comprehensive, context-specific, and prevention-oriented responses that strengthen the protection and empowerment of all people and communities. So moving from one of the criticisms actually at the time in which human security was emerging, and even into the debate on GA resolution, is that it's a very ambitious and broad concept, and it can't possibly be practical and applied in action, in policy development, in program development, in evaluation. So it was actually the work of the unit, of course, with many other partners and many other academics and people involved, to really develop the concept into an operational framework. And as you saw from the principles that are outlined in GA resolution, the way this was done was to develop a set of principles that provided kind of guideposts, different types of actions that needed to be undertaken when using human security in practice or as an operational tool. This allowed for the flexibility because, in addition to being a broad concept, human security, because it's focused on individuals and communities, is also something that has to be highly contextualized. So it has to allow for flexibility, and therefore a principle-based approach. An approach that was based on guideposts or ways of doing things, allowed for flexibility while also actually providing some useful guidance on how to implement human security in practice. So I won't go into great detail on each of the principles, but just to say that each of these principles has sort of a specific set of actions associated with them. So for example, if we're thinking about people-centered, it means that we have to ensure that the perspectives of affected communities and vulnerable groups are part of decision-making and planning around addressing, issues, for example, of crime and violence, or any issue at a community level. Being comprehensive means that we need to be thinking, again, very broadly, at least initially, across those 7 dimensions. So when we come into a situation, we really need to analyze the different types of insecurities and how the threats in that particular context are impacting those broad set of insecurities at the community level. Again, context specific, I think, is quite self-explanatory, but it means we're starting from the ground up. And as many of you know, this is true for sometimes with the United Nations, but many programming is that we design things at the headquarters level, and we do a more top-down approach. And what human security really is saying is we need to flip that approach and start from the ground up, and we need to find strategies that really are very much anchored in the realities on the ground and the realities that people are facing in their daily lives. I think, again, prevention-oriented is quite explanatory. We want to think about need and vulnerability. So not just current status, but the things that people could be potentially exposed to, the risks that they could be facing. So for example, a community living in an area that's very climate sensitive, an agricultural area that's climate sensitive, that is something that should always be taken into account when considering the challenges in that region. And then finally, human security, in addition to those 4 principles, human security requires what we call the protection and empowerment strategies. And this is particularly important. It will come back to it a little bit later. I think it's particularly relevant and important when we're thinking about programming and policies related to crime prevention and violence reduction. It means that we need to connect efforts that strengthen the protective infrastructure. So efforts that strengthen the policies, the institutions, the norms that protect people, and in tandem with or linked with initiatives that also empower people and help them sort of be active agents in promoting security in their daily lives. And that these two things, if they're meaningfully linked, if we actually connect efforts to improve the protective infrastructure with efforts to empower communities, we can really create conditions where transformation, even at a very sort of local level, can start to take hold. So ultimately, what we consider to be sort of the added value of the human security approach is that it provides this risk-informed perspective by, again, comprehensively, so across the 7 dimensions, addressing threats, their root causes, and their manifestations. We really want to, and we see this when we discuss issues related to the implementation of the SDGs, how important it is that we start to identify the interlinkages between different areas of insecurity. So for example, one of the things I noticed in looking at some of the statistics around crime and violence in the Latin American Caribbean region is some of these correlations between youth employment and crime rates, and also some correlations again with teen pregnancy and crime rates. So we really want to start to unpack more and more and start to understand those types of interlinkages. We want to assess the stress level and propose priority interventions that are integrated again. So not just understanding how things are interconnected, but then designing approaches that bring together different stakeholders so that we can have a much higher multiplier impact for communities and really start to make change in people's daily lives. And as you'll see, and this again we'll come back to a little bit more, all human security interventions really they must be multi-stakeholder. And this means both across different sectors, but also across levels of governance. So bringing together, local, national, regional, and even global, when appropriate, of course. It doesn't mean that all of these levels should be invoked in every intervention, but when appropriate, but that generally they need to be multi-level. So now I'll kind of just pause there on the human security approach and switch a little bit more into looking at the topic at hand, which is crime prevention and violence reduction in the region. And again, as I said, I am not an expert in this area. These are just based on both what we've learned through our programs that are supporting crime prevention and violence reduction in the Latin American Caribbean region, because the Trust Fund funds UN entities and their partners in supporting programs in all parts of the world. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. But also, of course, from regional and reputable regional research institutes that look at issues related to crime and violence. What's, I think, more important from a human security perspective than these specific indicators or statistics of crime is sort of what they mean in terms of why the human security approach could be of value. So, for example, looking at things like the fact that 141 cities, or more than half of cities, have higher rates of homicide, I believe was in this particular one, higher rates of homicide than the regional average. So the regional average was, I believe, 21.5 per 100,000 people. So 52% of the cities in the region have a higher rate than the regional average. And this again goes back to that point of context specificity and localization, and really ensuring that we're targeting based on the specificity of particular contexts. I think, of course, things like 80% of murder victims being male and half of them between 15 and 29 are very important indicators in terms of how we disaggregate our data collection, but also disaggregate and target our specific approaches. And this is something that I think some of our programs have done particularly well in terms of having highly targeted strategies for particular groups within a community, but within, of course, the umbrella of a broader program, so that there is benefit across the community in general, as this is something, these rates of crime and violence are, of course, something that affect the community at large. And also, of course, violence against women and violence against children being important factors in the region. A couple other that are of particular relevance are issues related to, and these were based on perception surveys, but low trust in police and judicial systems. And also, it seemed the political system, political institutions more broadly, how these crime and violence affects people's mobility. So this is choices in their daily life, things like where they might shop, where they might vacation, but also choices around more permanent migration or the desire to actually leave the country. And then, of course, the high economic costs of these levels of crime and violence. And of course, what I mentioned a little bit earlier, these correlations that are interesting to look at. And again, these are not causal, but there does seem to be sufficient and substantive research on some correlations between issues on youth unemployment, but also the quality of employment and crime rates, as well as teen pregnancy rates. So when we think about those statistics, and again, a broader set and broader scope of some of the programming that the program is funded, and again, I recognize that those are a very small part of the picture, but there are some sort of initial conclusions, right, that we can draw from a human security perspective. So the first is one is maybe very obvious that indeed this is really a very critical and pervasive and interconnected issue in the region. And that while the relationship between rates of crime and violence and economic growth, poverty, inequality, and sustainable development more broadly is very complicated and nuanced, we can say that with this level of pervasiveness, with the statistics, particularly at certain cities and certain communities, where it's just an overwhelming issue at that level, that crime and violence really need to be duly considered alongside broader efforts related to peace and security, development, and human rights. And that we really need to consider the interlinkages across issues. So even if we think it's something related specifically to employment or anti-poverty efforts, that we need to think about the relationship and the interconnection with issues of crime and violence, whether that be as an underlying cause or a root cause of it, or a consequence of it. As I mentioned, we also see really the very localized nature of crime and violence in the region. So there's a lot of diversity among countries in the region. And then even more importantly, if we go below the level of the state, we see that there's a lot of diversity within countries, between cities and localities, and that we really need to, and I think this is something that's already widely done, but require very highly tailored responses that are based on, again, those multi-level partnerships and multi-sector partnerships. Clearly, there's unequal impacts across groups, as I mentioned. So while society at large is impacted, we need to find ways in which we really are sort of very micro-targeting initiatives, but again, within a broader umbrella, so that we're not leaving out other subgroups or parts of the community that still are impacted, but maybe less directly or in different ways by high levels of crime and violence. And that ultimately all of our efforts need to take into account and need to implement processes that address this lack of trust. That through the process themselves, we are always thinking about ways in which we can bring together stakeholders and start to rebuild social fabric that may have been broken, or rebuild trust in institutions that's been lost as a result of many either real or perceived issues around impunity or corruption, etc. So I think the region has already undertaken quite a bit in terms of moving from a more law and order, a more traditional approach, towards the human security approach. And citizen security approaches, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, have been quite plentiful in the region. Many of the countries in the region have been implementing citizen security approaches at the national level, but at the community level as well. And this has been a transition over many decades, with the 70s and 80s more characterized by a conventional kind of approach that was characterized by more repressive police deployments, tougher penalties on offenders, and the construction of more prisons. But during this time, even though there was generally sort of support publicly for a more tough on crime type approach, as crime and violence increased and prison populations increased as well, despite broader social and economic processes, governments in the region and other actors in the region realized that there were maybe other types of approaches that needed to be undertaken as well. So beginning kind of in the 90s and 2000s, and this also, of course, as I mentioned, why it's interesting to go back to also the emergence of human security, is this also coincided with the emergence of human security. These citizen security approaches that were being developed and sort of really deviated from the standard law and order, sort of tough on crime type approach. And these programs differed structurally from past efforts and were frequently the results of partnerships between municipal leaders, private actors, and academia. And while there is great diversity, of course, in this programming and policy across the region and within countries, they can be broadly characterized as programs that prioritize safety, security, and the rights of residents within a framework of state responsibility and citizen engagement. They often consisted of integrated interventions that spanned security, justice, prevention, and governance sectors. And they included all types of things, including reforms to policing strategies, criminal justice procedures, alternatives to incarceration, primary, secondary, and tertiary violence prevention measures, as well as efforts to strengthen social cohesion and reinforce human rights frameworks and human rights policies and obligations of states and citizens. And while there is evidence that this sort of smarter policing and the strategic investments in prevention and the bolstering of social coexistence in violence-prone communities is cost-effective, there does also seem to be a consensus in the region that more evaluation, specific evaluation on these programs would be beneficial. In addition, given that violent crime and violence rates continue to increase in the region, despite, again, continued economic progress and growth and sustainable development achievement in the region as well, I would contend that it might be of value also to consider broadening the citizen security approach slightly towards a human security approach. And as I said, they're very interrelated. They're very much in line with each other. There is great alignment between the two approaches, but the latter could be considered, so human security could sort of be considered as a slightly broader umbrella framework under which many different tools and frameworks and approaches can fall, and so citizen security would also be one of those. So in this context in which there is evidence of some success, quite considerable success in some localities around citizen security initials, applying the human security approach, again, could be beneficial in terms of further broadening these efforts and further bolstering existing citizen security initiatives. So in this regard, I just wanted to share some lessons from UN Trust Fund for Human Security programs in the region. We've supported many programs over the years. The Trust Fund has been around for 20 years. And many of the programs include either as a central feature of the program or as a component of the program, elements related to crime and violence, and including, of course, citizen security approaches. These programs have largely focused on empowering communities to address the complex challenges of urban violence and crime, while reinforcing local and national protective mechanisms that are responsive to citizen insecurity. Such projects have sought to improve essential service infrastructure and delivery, expand employment opportunities, enhance social cohesion, establish dialogue and collaboration between authorities and people, as well as the police, and build the capacity of law enforcement and the judiciary. In the region, some of the countries that I'm specifically drawing these lessons from include Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Jamaica. But again, as you can see from the map, we've supported programs in many, many countries in the Latin American Caribbean region that have elements. So these are really lessons from a broad set of programs over a number of years. So when looking at the various programs, and of course, while recognizing that the specificities of each one, need to be reflected, there are some lessons across them that can help inform the future application of human security to address crime and violence in the region. So first, successfully reducing, and I think this has been something that's been evident throughout my presentation, but successfully reducing violence and crime requires an integrated and multidimensional approach that really does address the multitude of interconnected factors at the institutional and community levels. These factors are including, but not limited to, the economic structural dimension related to low quality jobs and insufficient social mobility, accelerated urban growth, really a rapid urbanization in some cases that erodes the social factors and social fabric, and other social factors such as an increase in single parent households, an increase in the presence of and access to weapons and drugs, and the networks that move them, as well as the capacity of the state to adequately address security challenges. So these very interconnected issues really cannot be addressed in isolation from each other, right? They need to be addressed together. And with its focus on prevention, human security recognizes that responses to crime must go beyond deterrence attempts of the criminal justice system to a much broader set of preventive programs, which have been shown to have a positive impact in the reduction of crime, including those related to housing, health and mental health issues, and education and employment. These programs must be targeted, however, based on the specific acts of violence, the type of vulnerability within a community, and the specific risk factors present and emerging, present and also potential. Since violence often takes many forms, gender-based, gang-related, organized criminal networks, awareness-raising activities to help change attitudes regarding violence, coupled with institutional efforts to restrict access to firearms, reduce gender gaps in employment and decision-making positions, and enforce formal protective mechanisms, particularly for children and youth, for example, are necessary for really making that sort of transformational change that we're hoping to see when we have such high prevalence of crime and violence. Some other lessons are around the benefit of participation. Promoting participatory processes, these programs supported the development of networks of diverse stakeholders. And the creation. Yeah.
5 more minutes.
Sure. I'm just about, this is the last slide. So these programs supported the development of networks of stakeholders and the creation of formal mechanisms for collaboration, which is particularly important when trust between institutions and people or communities is low. This can increase dialogue between government and their citizens, resulting in improved levels of trust and greater civic engagement. It promotes more frequent interaction and communication among urban residents, which can build positive social capital and increase social cohesion, which we often see as at a detriment in these kinds of contexts. And in addition, it helps bring together actors such as civil society, the private sector, the mass media, academia, etc., who have an important role in reinforcing safety, ensuring accountability, and shifting a mindsets away from a culture of violence towards one of peace and justice. On the institutional side, we saw the importance really of engaging again at the municipal level, as I mentioned, and developing stronger and more effective partnerships between municipal, national, and regional authorities, again, where appropriate and where it makes sense. It also allows for the necessary upstreaming and downstreaming of policy decisions, thereby filling some of the gaps that might exist at different levels of governance in terms of protection and safety. At the local levels, these programs also prioritize citizen participation. This not only allowed for really well-tailored responses, but also enhanced the capacity of local communities, building on the existing skills and knowledge and strengths that they have to contribute to safe environments and, of course, a more peaceful and cohesive society or community. By taking ownership of local programs and participating in dialogues, communities will be in a better position to inform and implement legitimate and sustainable public policies towards citizen security, crime prevention, violence reduction. The focus on the local is also crucial for ensuring that young people, including girls and young women, are meaningfully engaged so real opportunities can be created to reduce their vulnerability and build their resilience in addition to better protecting them. So one last thing just to end on is, while it is important, while we've seen that there are quite a few initiatives that have been quite successful in the region, not through the Trust Fund, both through the Trust Fund, but also the many citizen security initiatives in the region that have been successful, one of the challenges has also been around sustainability and scalability, because also this type of approach really takes a lot of effort to put together. It's important to underline that this comprehensive, multi-stakeholder, multi-sector approach is very ideal, and it's easy to say that this is what we should do, but it's extremely challenging to implement, and we see that in our programs as well. It really requires significant adjustments in administrative, operational, and strategic structures and processes, as well as a lot of political will across all of these institutions. So it can be often the biggest hurdle itself to really implementing citizen security, but definitely human security approaches, is just being able to bring stakeholders together and to engage or to have enough buy-in that the different types of adjustments that are necessary can actually take hold. However, when this time is invested, when there is real buy-in from all of the stakeholders, we have seen that this type of comprehensive, context-specific, people-driven, and more preventive approach can really lead to positive outcomes and cost-effective outcomes when it comes to all types of complex crises, including and especially crime prevention and violence reduction. So I will end there. I apologize for going over time, and I'll stop sharing my screen as well and welcome any questions and further discussion. Thank you.
Bueno, agradecemos a la doctora Hitomi Kubo por su brillante exposición sobre el tema de derechos humanos y reducción de muertes violentas en América Latina. Tengo alrededor de 4 preguntas que voy a hacer una lectura, digamos, simultánea para que se proceda a contestar. En la medida que se conteste, me imagino que otras personas podrían preguntar y pues procederíamos a una segunda ronda de preguntas. She wants to know if the Venezuela situation, she wants to know if ONU, National Organization, United National Organization, sorry, I can't translate because it's very difficult to me for Daniela.
Maybe I can help you. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Hello, Hitomi. Sorry, I'm going to translate you the 3 questions, all right? The second one was about the social changes and how do you see that social changes in Venezuela have been guaranteed the welfare in the population, or the consequences for hunger and poorness and poverty in Venezuela. The first question, maybe Daniel can repeat it because I didn't hear it, and then can translate it for Hitomi.
Es una pregunta muy sencilla, que básicamente si consideran que las Naciones Unidas ha intervenido en Venezuela, sí o no, y por qué.
Okay, they are asking about the UN intervention in Venezuela. If it happened really, or is it's existent or not, and why? Which are the reasons, about this intervention in Venezuela or not intervention? And the third question was about the UN politic. Daniel, ¿me repites la tercera pregunta, la política de las Naciones Unidas?
Sí, la pregunta de las Naciones Unidas es relacionada a la que hiciste, sobre si, a ver, si es que Venezuela vive una situación de amenaza o falta de
dignidad. It's the same question from the same student. And the fourth question is in the countries where there has been high levels of violence and nothing has been done by the countries to reduce violence, what area of United Nations would have an effective policy?
The third question is related with the UN politic and intervention in Venezuela, right? They're asking how it's perceived. It's like a kind of like a warning, or like a not well received intervention. How it's been perceived, the intervention in Venezuela. And the second one is about violence. What would be a good practice, or a good related, with the UN politic to fight against violence in Venezuela? That's how that was what I understood from the questions, but they are related. The last three ones.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much for that translation. I appreciate that. So first, and I apologize, I think I'm going to disappoint the people who are listening. I am by no means an expert on the situation in Venezuela, and couldn't tell you in great detail about the UN actions, except for sort of more broadly in Venezuela. But looking at it from a human security perspective, just to provide some response here, I think we would look at the situation in Venezuela ultimately as a failure of human security. And in these instances, when there is quite an extraordinary need for humanitarian assistance, so emergency response to support people in getting just their very basic needs met, that in that moment, although humanitarian response is different from human security, we would say probably that you need to prioritize the humanitarian response in that context. However, where human security can then be helpful in a context like Venezuela, where there is sort of overwhelming humanitarian needs by the local population, and also the population that has fled Venezuela into neighboring countries, that it's still helpful to think about how the initial humanitarian response links to broader efforts to help address the cause of the crisis in Venezuela, sort of strengthen the governance infrastructure, and have more sort of sustainable development interventions for the people in the community in the longer term. And human security can be really helpful in terms of connecting that initial humanitarian response in a framework that thinks more about the longer term development and longer term transformation that's needed for peace and security to really take hold, and therefore later on sustainable development to also take hold. In terms of the UN, again, I can't tell you that much about, I'm not that familiar with the UN as a very big organization, and I am not an expert in Venezuela, but I would say that the entire UN family is working, so meaning the different entities of the UN, the World Food Program, the UN Refugee Agency, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, the UN Development Program, all of the different specialized entities of the UN, as well as the political office. So there is a UN political mission, of course, in Venezuela through the Department of Political and Peace-Building Affairs. They are all, of course, activated and working to support the communities and to support the government. And I know, because we do have an active program in Colombia right now, a lot of what the UN family is doing in neighboring countries that are receiving high levels of Venezuelan migrants is also thinking about how do they integrate these refugees and migrants from Venezuela into existing programming and providing the kind of support for them in neighboring countries such as Colombia. I don't know what else I could say specifically about Venezuela. As I said, I am not an expert, but in terms of good practices, I think going back to what I was saying in the presentation, it is a lot about trying to really identify the underlying drivers that are driving this kind of instability. So whether this be in the context of Venezuela or in terms of a particular city in Latin America that has very high levels of crime, or a country that has very high levels of crime. And it's about trying to address, and sometimes that is about political institutions and politics, and these are harder and usually dealt with through diplomatic processes, but also at the community level, addressing those underlying causes of insecurity, and to allow people to have opportunities and options and really be able to realize some of their aspirations in life, so that a life of crime and violence, or even being victims of crime and violence, are less attractive. I shouldn't say it, please, not that ever being a victim is attractive, but the option of sometimes being recruited into criminal networks. So it's really about taking this multi-sectoral and root cause type of approach, even when there's sort of emergency situations.
Ok, tengo una pregunta más. Habla sobre es del estudiante Francisco Molina Jerez.
From student Linda Maria Jerez. According to the United Nations Against Drug and Crime, the homicide rate in Chile is like 3 to 5 homicides per 1,000 inhabitants. When we focus on the problems in the prisons, it increases to 90 homicides per 1,000 inhabitants. The question is there any study on the deaths inside the prisons in other countries?
Sorry, Hitomi, could you hear it, or should I translate also?
Oh, no, sorry. Yes, please translate.
Okay. This is a question about drugs and delict. They are asking if one student just say some kind of numbers about the delicts in Chile, and there's very high the delict rate in Chile, and they are asking if you are doing some kind of research about this topic, because it's a very hot topic in Chile right now, and the numbers are like showing this phenomenon.
Daniela, la pregunta específica es sobre las cárceles en Chile, si hay violencia en las cárceles.
Okay, and the violence within prisons.
Oh, prison violence.
Right.
Mm-hmm. My unit is not undertaking any research on this particular issue. We are broader, more technical guidance on human security, but definitely I would gather that the UN Office for Drugs and Crimes, which is a big UN agency in the region, and I would say present in most countries. I don't know if they're present in Chile, but I would guess that they would, and they are probably doing research on this issue, and that would be a good place to start in terms of understanding rates of prison violence. And the Igarape Institute, I'm not sure if in Brazil, has done some very, very good research also. And I mean, their focus was more on homicide, but they do look also at the relationship with more focus on imprisoning people in the more traditional approaches in the 70s, 80s, and how that has led to a really skyrocketing rate of people in prison now today. So I think that would be another place in terms of a regional institute that's doing research in this area.
Sí. Dice,
So,
dice gracias por responder y ayudar.
thank you for
Vemos la situación, estamos
answering the situation where
la estudiante de la situación de Venezuela.
the intentions of
Hay
Venezuela.
otra pregunta, dice,
There's another question from the perspective of security of the U.S. policy. You can talk about a doctrine of titulation
sobre la protesta, e incluso hay
on the protest that has influenced Latin America. I think this is the social protest. There is a specific doctrine on security about the protests in Latin America.
About security policy en Estados Unidos, ¿verdad, Daniel?
yeah,
Security policy in the US about the social protest in Latin America. If you think there is a security policy in this kind of phenomena in Latin America.
So I definitely do not know enough about this issue to speak about it intelligently. There is no question that there has been collaboration and between the US and governments in Latin America region, and some of the policies, I think, policy decisions in the region sometimes have been influenced by financial support and funding from other countries, including the US. But I don't know enough about any specific security policies around social protests and social movements in the region in the US. It's just not my area of study. I wouldn't want to say something incorrect.
Saying we have no more questions, so we are waiting if we have more space for questions or we are closing this session.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for all of those questions and for everybody that was listening. I see there's quite a bit of interest in the situation in Venezuela, and I would be happy to try to connect people with other experts in the UN who actually work on the question of Venezuela and work on the situation of Venezuela if that's helpful.